or an Airbnb or whatever he's doing, he decides that he's going to spend a little bit of time figuring out what the city of Athens is like. And so Paul goes out amongst the people and he checks out the city. Now during this time in the area where he was at, this area was known for its great philosophers. Like people that we read about in our textbooks in schools stood in this area in Athens, and they shared their beliefs and they shared their philosophies. Like people like Plato's and people like Aristotle stood in the same forum that Paul would eventually stand in and share their beliefs years before Paul would do so. But Paul starts checking the city out, and he starts to notice, and actually verse 16 of Acts chapter 17 says that Paul, while waiting for these two men in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. History tells us that during the time of Nero, there were some 30,000 idols in this city in which Paul was in. Like these people believed, they were a very religious people. They just weren't quite sure what they believed in. There's a story that is said that at one point they wanted to honor the gods within the city, but they didn't really know like where the gods resided, and so they let a bunch of sheep go throughout the city. And the idea was where the sheep stopped or where the sheep laid down, that's certainly a place where a god was residing. And so they would make a statue or put a statue in that area to this god, and they would sacrifice the sheep. The thought was simply that the sheep would probably go to the temples that they had built to these gods that they worshipped, but the sheep would just wander around like sheep do, and they would find a cozy place to lay down, and they would lay down just in a random spot. And so the people thought, well, certainly there's a god that resides in that area, and so they would make a statue or an altar. And Paul sees this, and he's bothered by this. Again, he's waiting on people to show up, but he just can't help himself. And in verse 17, it says, so he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks and all, as well in the marketplace day by day with those who happen to be there. Like Paul sees what's going on, and so he starts preaching. He starts sharing the good news of Jesus to anybody that would listen. And enough people started to listen, and there was enough of a crowd that started to gather that a group known as the Areopagus, a group of some 30 philosophers who would just sit and listen to different philosophies, they said, well, you're teaching, and we're intrigued by this, but don't just go teach in the marketplace and on the streets. Like, come into the same place that these philosophers who were here years before, like, come into this area, and we'll listen to what you have to say. And Paul was happy to do so. In verse 22 of chapter 17, it said, Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, men of Athens, I see in every way that you are religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. He says, now what you worship as something unknown, I'm going to proclaim to you. And I love what Paul simply does. He goes to a place in an area that he doesn't really know that well and that he doesn't understand that well, and he finds common ground. He finds a statue that is made to a god that they don't even know who the god is, so they just put to an unknown god, and he says, let me tell you about this God because I know about this God. And he starts to teach to them, and he starts to preach to them, and he starts to share, and he would share in ways that they understood, and he would explain to them who God was and how he sent his son into this world and how he was crucified, but also how he defeated death. And in verse 32, it says, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, some of them laughed, but others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. In verse 33, at that, Paul left the council, but it said a few men became followers of Paul and believed. One of them was Dionysius, who became a minister at the church in that area, and another one named Damaris, a woman named Damaris. And then it ends by saying, and a number of others. And I love this because Paul walks into this area that he doesn't know. See, Paul was he was schooled. He says this. He was schooled in Jewish culture or Jewish thought. He was rising fast among the ranks before God got a hold of his life. Like, he understood Jewish culture, but he was smack dab in the middle of Greek culture, and yet he's able to find common ground. The other story that I want to take a look at is found in the Old Testament. And again, this is a story that I'm willing to bet the majority of you know. And this story deals with a man by the name of Jonah. If you're familiar with this story, then this can just be a refresher. If not, God comes to a man by the name of Jonah, and he says, go to the city of Nineveh and preach against it because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah didn't want to do what God wanted him to do because there's a good chance that from a young age, Jonah's parents told him, hey, let's not have anything to do with the Assyrians, especially Nineveh. Because Israel's greatest enemy at this point in time was the Assyrians, and one of the Assyrians' main cities was Nineveh. Nineveh was said to have walls that stood 100 foot tall and were wide enough that 3 chariots could race across or ride across the top of them side by side by side. And the Ninevites, they practiced witchcraft, they practiced prostitution, murder. They were prideful people. They were just cruel people. They were the kind of people, again, that your parents said, hey, when you're riding your bike, make sure that you turn and go down this alley because I don't want you going in front of this house. Right? That's the kind of people that the Ninevites were. And Jonah would have known what kind of people they were. So Jonah gets this idea that he's going to outrun God. So he goes down to Joppa. He boards a ship and he sails as far away in the opposite direction to Tarshish as he could because he didn't want to go do what God wanted him to do. Of course, if you know this story, God gets a hold of him, sends a great wind or sends a great storm, and they're throwing things over the side of the boat trying to save their lives. And eventually Jonah realizes that what God is doing, so he tells these men, like, hey, I'm the issue, I'm the problem, just get rid of me and everything will be all right. And they don't want to do it because who would want to throw somebody overboard? And eventually they do. And God, in Scripture says that God sent a great fish that swallowed Jonah. And this is one of those stories that when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask God some questions about this, like what kind of fish and what was it like and you know, why. And it doesn't really matter, but I'm just curious about this story. And Jonah ends up going to Nineveh regardless if he wanted to or not. And when he gets to Nineveh, in chapter 3 of Jonah tells us that when he gets there, he obeys the word of the Lord and he goes and he starts to preach. Verse 4 of chapter 3 says, on the first day, Jonah started into the city and he proclaimed, and this is what he said, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overturned. And verse 5 says the Ninevites believed. They believed God and they declared a fast, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. When the news reached the king of Nineveh, this is verse 6 of chapter 3, he rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. Then he issued a proclamation in Nineveh. He says, by the decree of the king and his nobles, don't let any man or beast, herd or flock, taste anything. Don't let them eat or drink, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Verse 9 says, who knows, God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. And then verse 10, as chapter 3 ends, says, when God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he had compassion and did not bring upon them destruction, the destruction that he had threatened. Which is cool. But that's not the rest. That's not the end of the story. Like growing up, and when we learn the story at a young age, like that's the end of the story. Jonah didn't do what God wanted him to do. He was swallowed by a fish, and then did what God wanted him to do. The rest of the story goes on that Jonah's ticked. Jonah's mad because God had compassion on these people. Jonah's mad because probably from an early age, his parents were saying, these people are awful, don't have anything to do with these kind of people, stay away from these kind of people. And he probably thought that God wouldn't want to have anything to do with these kind of people, yet God does. And yet God sees that they turn from their evil ways, and he had compassion upon them, and he didn't destroy them like Jonah wanted him to. And it's so much so that Jonah goes out and he just sits down and wishes he was dead. Like, God, I just wish, I don't understand why you do something like this. I just wish I was dead. And God gets Jonah's attention. Again, you think Jonah would have learned after he got his attention the first time, spending a few days in the belly of a large fish. But this time, God provides a plant that grows, and it covers Jonah and gives him a little bit of shade and a little bit of relief. And then the next day, God provides a worm that eats the plant, and it withers away. And God provides a hot wind and sun that just scorches Jonah. And there's this conversation that takes place between God and Jonah towards the end of the book of Jonah. And Jonah, or God asks Jonah, he says, have you any right to be angry? Oh, verse 9 says the same thing. Do you have any right to be angry with me about the vine? And Jonah, kind of a stupid conversation or stupid answer, says, yeah, I do. And then God gets his attention and says, look, you cared more about this vine that was providing a little bit of shade, but there's 120,000 people living in Nineveh, and really you didn't care anything about them. And that ends the story of Jonah, and we don't really know kind of the rest of the story of what took place with Jonah. Like, I'd like to believe that Jonah finally figured out, okay, God really cares for these people, and I'm being an idiot and I'm being selfish. And again, we don't know the rest of what takes place with him, but I wanted to bring up these two stories this morning because we get two different glimpses of two different ways to act with two different people who walk into two completely different cultures. Paul walks into a culture that he doesn't understand. It's a Greek culture where there are all kinds of other gods that are being worshipped, and he grew up in a Jewish culture. Jonah walks into to Nineveh, which he had been told and knew just the destruction that took place in that area and the wild living that took place in that area. And you can see two big differences in the way that these men act. It makes sense as to why Paul would say what he says in 1 Corinthians 9. Paul says this, he says, though I am free and belong to no man, this is verse 19, I make myself a slave to everyone as to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though myself I am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. Verse 21, to those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law, as to win those not having the law. Verse 22, to the weak I became weak to win the weak. I become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Not only that, but you flip your page over in your Bible, and in 1 Corinthians 13, he starts out by saying this. He says, if I speak in tongues of men and angels, but I have no love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains but have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames but have not love, I gain nothing. Paul understood what he was doing. He was walking into a culture that he didn't understand, but he was walking in with love. And he could have walked in with this idea that I know better, and I'm right, and you're wrong, and so you have to listen to me, and you need to do what I say. But if he would have done that, it wouldn't have done any good. It would have been like he says in 1 Corinthians 13, it would have been like a gong that was just being beat on time and time again, or cymbals that were being clashed together time and time again, and nobody wants to listen to that. My son just got a drum set, believe me, all right? Nobody wants to listen to that. Instead, he walks in with love, and he finds a common ground and says, you're religious people. You serve an unknown God. Let me tell you about this. And the opposite of that is Jonah. Jonah was forced to go into an area, and he preached. And yes, God did amazing things through Jonah, but there was a difference that took place. Jonah did it not willingly and not out of love. Paul did it willingly, and Paul did it out of love. So what's that mean for us today? And I want to talk about this for just the next few minutes. What's it mean for us today? How can we engage in a culture that is hard for us to understand? I was reading this book this week, and I was really struggling. My greatest struggle when it's my chance to get up here and preach is what to preach on. And I sometimes, like, I'll make notes in my phone, months in advance, and I'll go to that part of my phone and I'll look and say, oh, okay, let's go with this. And I was praying about it, and God was probably answering my prayer. I just probably wasn't listening, and I couldn't figure it out. And I picked up this book and I just started reading it. It's a book that I read a long time ago, and it was just a book that it was convicting me the more and more that I read, and I just couldn't put it down. And I'm reading this book, and I quoted from it earlier, from Mark Driscoll's Radical Reformation, and in it, he shares about it was a Harvard professor, I can't think of his name, but he writes a book, and this book is titled Bowling Alone. Now, this book that I was reading was published in 2004, so understand that what I'm about to tell you takes place many years ago, but this Harvard professor that wrote a different book called Bowling Alone, he starts to quote and starts to talk about the culture that we live in is ever-changing. And I believe, and if you walk into my office, there's a whiteboard above my desk, and there's nothing new written on it for a long time, but there's a quote, and you've heard me say it before, and you'll hear me say it again, and it's written there, and it's probably permanent by now because I haven't erased it forever, but it says, we have a responsibility to take the gospel the gospel that never changes to a world that'll never be the same. And this Harvard professor who wrote this book called Bowling Alone, he said that we are engaging and have to learn to engage with a culture that is ever changing. Now, mind you, these statistics that I'm going to share with you, they were compiled between like the mid 80s and the late 90s, which seem like they wouldn't make sense. But I want to share these with you because I do think they make sense for us today. Here's what he said. He says, we're living in a time when people aren't coming out like they used to. He says, he asked the question, how do we share the gospel with others when it becomes so much harder? He says the number of people who are getting together to play cards socially is down 25%. Now, again, this is from the mid-'80s to the late 90s. This is down 25%. Frequenting bars and nightclubs and taverns is down 40%. The number of full-service restaurants is down 25%, but the number of fast food restaurants is up 100%. Having a social evening with someone from one's neighborhood is down 33%. Family dinners are down 33%, and having friends over is down 45%. And I find it interesting that he writes this, compiling these statistics from, 25, 35 years ago, and I think they're just as true now as they've ever been, because now we're living in the midst of a pandemic where our doors are being shut more and more because the fear of the COVID virus. And I'm not knocking that in any way. I'm saying this is the reality that we're living in. Yet we as a body of believers, we have a responsibility to share the gospel with those who we come in contact with. Yet more and more people are shutting their doors, and more people are saying, "I need to stay inside so that I can stay safe." And so, if we think the number of playing cards was down 25% 30 years ago, what is it today? If we're not opening our doors to invite people in 30 years ago, how much are we opening our doors to invite people in today to be able to build relationships and be able to share with people? The restaurant one blew my mind. The number of full-service restaurants is down 25%. I get frustrated every time I walk up to the doors at Taco Bell that I can't even go inside and sit down and eat inside. I have to eat Taco Bell in my car instead of enjoying it inside. And it's the world that we're living in is food is being delivered to us. Groceries are being delivered to us. We're not even going out as much and engaging with our culture anymore, maybe like Paul was or even Jonah was. And so we have to figure out how is it that we can share the good news of Jesus with those that are around us. And we sing this song here at Meadowview, and we sing it every once in a while, and it's a song that's called God of the City. Now, if you were here last week, Dad did communion meditation, and he was brave enough to sing from up here on the stage. I promise you that I will not sing these words. You will never come back. The words of God of this city are quite simple. It says, "You're the God of this city, you're the King of these people, you're the Lord of this nation. You're the light in this darkness, you're the hope to the hopeless, you're the peace to the restless. There is no one like our God." And the chorus goes, "For greater things have yet to come, and greater things are still to be done in this city." And my question is, if we believe these words that we often sing here during our worship time, that God is still willing and is going to do greater things in our city, then we have to believe that we have to be a kind of people who are willing to go out and engage a culture that maybe we don't understand. See, it's my belief that in the world that we live in, and let me pause real quick, it's exciting yet nerve-wracking to me that this place is filled today. It's exciting because with the world that we're living in today, with more people staying at home and more people being able to watch online, less people are coming out, and there's more of a responsibility for us as a church for us to go into our world, into our workplace, to be able to share the gospel. Back at 50 years ago, more people maybe were coming into the churches, but the churches, we're not seeing that trend as much. And maybe it's because of fear, maybe it's for other reasons, I don't know exactly, but there's a huge responsibility for us to be able to go engage with the world that's around us. And if we believe that God is the God of this city, that he's still going to do great things, that means that we have to engage our culture, that maybe it just simply means we have to engage with our neighbors. And again, it's a tough thing to do because there's been multiple times that I've passed multiple people that I know out in the stores and not even talk to them because I don't recognize them from their eyes up. Let alone have a conversation with a stranger, because who wants to talk with a stranger, because who knows, maybe that person would cause them to become sick. So what's that look like for us, and how do we do it? I'll tell you, one of my struggles is simply this, if I'm being honest with you. There's one person that as I'm writing this week and going over this week, there's one person in my mind that keeps popping up that I need to have a conversation with at some point. And I struggle big time because when I go to the gym and I go to sign in and I see this person's name and then I see the time that they're there, if they're anywhere within 2 hours of when I'm there, like there's a big temptation for me just to turn around and walk out the door. Because if they're there and they get access to the music before anybody else does, it's a tough place to be. Now, I'll talk with this person and I'll have just very generic conversations. How's it going? Have a good day. That's the extent of our conversation. And I'll crank the headphones that I have on as loud as I can to try to drown out their music, because I can't stand the words that are being said of their music and the words that are being said underneath this person's breath. And I know him just enough to know that the lifestyle that he's living would probably be a lifestyle that was similar to what maybe Jonah thought the Ninevites was living. And yet I'm in a place where it's, where we could easily have conversation because we have something in common. We're at the gym at the same time. Much like Paul was at a place where he could have something in common with the people of Athens because he was able to have a conversation with them. And I believe that we have to get out of our comfort zones and we have to start engaging with people around us, not just the people who look like us and act like us and talk like us, but more so the people who don't. And this man is probably as opposite of me as it comes. And I know, like I said, I've been convicted the whole time that I've been going through this week, that this is where I have to start. But it's tough. But again, I believe more now than ever that it's our responsibility as a church to get to people around us. And it's probably as hard as ever to get to people around us, but that shouldn't deter us. I want to leave you with one last story, and Jesus tells the story, and Luke records it in Luke chapter 10, and it's a story, again, that you're familiar with. I know that you are, and so we're not going to read it and spend a lot of time with it, but consider this story. Jesus tells that there's a man that was beat up and left for dead in the ditch. Right? We know the story is the Good Samaritan. What takes place? There's a man who walks by. The first man who walks by, he sees the man laying in the ditch, and it just so happens that the first man is a priest, a minister, if you will. And he sees the man lying in the ditch, but he doesn't want to have anything to do with him. He doesn't want to help him because if he would help him, if he would go over and he would touch this man that is left for dead, who's dirty and who's bloody, then he himself would be considered unclean. Now, the whole unclean thing might be a little difficult for us to understand, so let me say it this way. If this minister would go over and have anything to do with this man, he would be quarantined. For the next however many days, he would be quarantined, and so he couldn't go, and he couldn't preach, and he couldn't do what it is that he needed to do. And so the story continues. Jesus continues telling this story, and the second guy that comes by is a Levite. And again, if the Levite would go have anything to do with this man, what would take place? He would be considered unclean, or he'd be quarantined. He'd have to stay home for, 14 days, 10 days, 7 days, whatever it is. And it was the third man who rolls along, and this man was the Samaritan. And we talked about the Samaritans at the beginning of the story. It was this man who was a Samaritan who was probably the person who lived on the other side of the tracks. He was the person that he stepped across.